Okay, today's daf is daf Samach Daled. Bez Hashem will begin on daf Samach Gimel Omid Beis, all the way by the bottom of the page. Ketzad Yorad. You're familiar with this concept. I'm sure that Safik Kuma B'Rshus Harabim Sveikei Tamei. In other words, you're walking on the street, a private road, or you walk into your backyard, and you don't know if you touched a dead body or if you touched a sheretz. Right, a dead rodent. Now, imagine a sheretz in the Torah refers to a specific type of rodent. It's like a gecko. Remember, if you ever see the Geico commercial, so that mascot is a gecko. If that's dead and you touch it, you become tamei. That's called a sheretz. So if you become tamei for the day, right? And let's say you're in your backyard, and you don't know if you touch that dead gecko or not. So the din is that what? It's a safek tumah. You're in doubt whether you became tamei. And the question is in a reshus hayachid. It's in your backyard, so we assume that you're tamei. If this same safek tumah was in a reshus harabim, if this same problem occurred in the reshus harabim, you're not sure if you touched it, so then we go Sveiketar. Hi, Lewis. We just began with Samach Gimel Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. So we're talking about a dead sheretz. So now you're going to learn something you probably never knew before. Let's say you're swimming in your pool, right? And there's a dead gecko, a dead sheretz there. And you don't know if you touched that dead sheretz. So your first reaction is, you get out of the pool. I'm not sure if I touched it. I'm tamei. Why? Safek Tumah B'Rshus Hayachid is we go strict, Sveikai Tama. But that's not true, because then the Torah tells you that for this you go lenient. Safa, if the sheretz is floating on the water, Eina Metama Le'inyan sheretz. There's no Tumah regarding sheretz, and it's not only by sheretz; it's also by a mace. Let's say there's a corpse there in the pool that you're swimming in, and you don't know if you touched it or not. Since since we're dealing with touching, there's a halacha in the Torah that says that the safek tumah should go lenient. The Tanya we learned to the Brisa, safek tumah. You have a doubtful if you touch the tumah, safa, and the tumah was floating on water. Bein bekalim, bein bekarka. Whether the tumah is floating in a keli or a karka. Let's say karka is, we'll call a swimming pool, or kalim is, there's a barrel full of water, and the tumah is on top of the water in the barrel, and you don't know if you touched the tumah or not. That's in the barrel that has water in it and it's floating on top. Tahira, we go tahar. We say yatar. Rab Shimon says bekalim. If there's in a barrel, again, the barrel full of water, and you're not sure if you touched the tumah which is on top of the barrel, tameya, you'll become tamei. Bekarka, but Rab Shimon agrees that if the tumah is on the pool in the ground, right, in-ground pool, then if you're not sure if you touched it, tahira yatar. So this is a brand new thing. You always assume safek tumah b'rshus hayachid is sveikai tamei, but that depends. Only if the tumah was on the ground. But if it's floating in the water and you're not sure if you touched it, then we go tahira. So the Gemara says, my time we're going to Samach Daled Aleph. My time at the Tanakama, what's the reason of the Tanakama that says no matter what happens, no matter if the Tumah is floating on water, Sveikoi Tahar. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi explained, Siv, it says in the Pasuk, B'chol hasheretz hashoretz. If you touch any sheretz, wherever it grows. Again, we're using the example of a gecko, but there are 8 shrutzim. I think some of them are a hedgehog, or a salamander. So b'chol hasheretz hashoretz. No matter when you touch it, kol makom shu shoretz, wherever you touch it, wherever it grows, you become tamei. Uksiv, but then the pasuk says al haaretz, only if you touch it, the dead sheretz, while it's on the ground. Hoketzad. How do you resolve that? One pasuk says you could touch it when it's on your desk, and one says it has to be you're touching it when it's on the earth. So the Gemara says, Vadei megoi, if the question is you for sure touched it, so tamei, you're always tamei. Doesn't matter where the sheretz is, where the dead sheretz is, if it's in your pool or it's on the backyard, you're tamei. Sveikei Maikoi, but if you're not sure if you touched it, now normally you would go strict. So then only if it's on the earth, you would go strict. But if it's in a pool of water, tar, it's tar, and that's what the Tanakama holds, that as long as the Toma is on a pool of water, then we have a halacha from the Torah that says if you have a doubt that you touched it, you should go tar, you should go lenient. Rab Shimon, my Tama, what's here Rab Shimon? Rab Shimon says, yes, I'll agree if it's floating on water, you'll become tar, is sveikai tar, but if the tuma is floating on top of a barrel, let's say, in a barrel full of water, right? Then Rab Shimon says then you're still tamei, even if you're in doubt, because he has another pasuk. Amar Ula says, it says in the pasuk, Ach Mayan, it says if there is a Mayan. Mayan is a water, is a pool of water. And it says that the Torah says that if you go there, it's mitar you, a spring of water. Uksiv, and then its pasuk says, Yitma, that if you touch the dead carcass of a sheretz, you become tamei. So how do you resolve that? If you touch it in water, you're tahar, and if you touch it and you become tamei, okay, tzad, safa bekalim. If it's floating in water, says Rab Shimon, even in a keli, let's say it's floating in a barrel, then tamei, you are tamei. Bekarka, but if it's floating in a pool of water, in a backyard swimming pool, tahar, then you'll be tahar. Okay, so that's Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon doesn't go so lenient. He just says that if it's floating in your swimming pool and then you go sveikei tahar. But if it's floating, if the tumah is floating in a barrel full of water, then you would still say sveikei tamei. Again, all this is dealing with Rishus HaYachid, where the question is in your private backyard, where normally you would go tamei, and if it's floating in water, an open body of water, you're tahar. The Gemara brings a brisa and continues this discussion. Tana Rabbanan said, although we said that if the sheretz or even a dead piece of flesh is floating in the water and you're not sure if you touched it, you're tahar, but kol hani tolim bahani gararin. Let's say it's held on a string. The sheretz is held on the gecko. Let's say the dead sheretz is held on a string by a human hand, or it's in somebody's hand floating in the water. So really, who's controlling it? Not the water, but the guy that's holding it in his hand in the water or holding it on a rope in the water. Then we don't consider it as if it's floating in the water. Sveikin tamei. Then the sveikin is tamei. We consider it as if you are resting, as if it's resting on the earth, and therefore it's not considered like floating in water, and therefore sveikin tamei. Let's say somebody threw a sheretz, a dead sheretz, he threw it in the airspace, and we're not sure if it hit somebody or not. So sveikin tar, its suffix would be tar. So here we see a new thing. Then not only if it's floating on the water, do we say sveikin tar, but if you throw it in the air and it's not on the ground, it's just floating in the airspace, and you don't know if it hit somebody or not, then we go sveikoi tahar. Now, chutz, except what situations do we say everything is different? Min akazayis hames, v'hama'el pnei atuma. Here, we're not taught if you have a dead human flesh, size of a kazayis, and the person swam underneath. So it's the kazayas min hames was on top of him. Okay, he swam underneath the kazayas min hames, not touching it, and you're not sure if he swam underneath or not. V'hama'el al pnei atuma. Or let's say you have a corpse strapped at the bottom of the pool, and you don't know if you're not sure if the swimmer swam over the dead body. So then since we're not dealing with touching, since we're not dealing with touching, we're dealing with a new type of tumah called oiha mace, being in the same airspace of a dead body. So then we would say sveikoi tamei. This only heter of things floating in water, where you would say sveikoi tahar, is only by a sheretz and only by a mace if you touch it. But if the question is, the suffix is whether you swam under the mace or swam over the mace, so then you go tamei. It would include also a zav and zava who have this unique ability to metama things, even though they don't touch it directly. A zav that sits, let's say, on 10 mattresses, even though he doesn't touch the bottom mattress, all the mattresses are tummy. So what happens? You have a zav and a zava swimming in a pool. A girl, you know what a zav? But you know, again, a zav is a man who has semen coming out of his body, but a sickly type of semen. So therefore, he's a tummy, and he's going in the water, and he's floating. So he's the tummy that's floating because he's swimming, and he doesn't know if he moved. You see, a zav has the unique ability to metama something just by causing it to move. Let's say a zav is sitting at a desk, and he bangs on the table, and the vessel jumps. So then he made the vessel tummy. So if the zav was swimming in a pool, and we're not sure if he caused a certain vessel that was on the other side of the pool to move, so then since it's not a din of maga, it's not a suffix if he touched it, it's a suffix if he moved it. So then you would go strict and say sveikai tamei. Okay, so now let's just go back, and this is typical Gemara style. We said again that if you have a dead sheretz, imagine a dead gecko in the water, and you're not sure if you touched it, you are tahar. You have a dead mace, a dead human flesh in the body, and you're not sure if you touched it. Also in the swimming pool, you're not sure if you touched it. What happens? You are tahar. But let's say now this is typical Gemara. What's called touching the water? Rabbi Bachama asked the question. Mace, you have a dead flesh. Bikli, it's floating in a vessel in the water. There's no water in the vessel. It's just in the vessel in the water. The kli soft al pnei hamayim, but the kli is floating on the water. Is that called floating? Is that called as if the flesh is floating on water? Where you would say sveikai tamei. Bosa kli azlinam. Do you go that it's in a keli, and therefore it's like as if it's resting on the ground, and therefore you should say sveikai tamei. At the end of the day, it's floating on water, albeit not directly, but touching a clay. So maybe you call it as floating on water, and you would say, if you're not sure if you touched it, sveikai tar. Then we go, intim tzloime. If you want to say, bosa kli azlinim, that again, that when a sheretz, let's say, or a mace is in the keli, floating on water, that's not called floating on water. That's not called touching water. And therefore, sveikoi tamei. Okay? So what happens? Mace, you have the dead flesh, but it's not floating in a keli. It's al gabe sheretz. Imagine a dead piece of human flesh on top of a dead gecko. Okay? Maho, what would you say about that? And you're not sure if you touch the dead flesh. Even, is it considered that is since the flesh is on the sheretz, perhaps we consider the flesh as if it's floating in the water and sveikai tar. But you will say not. Kiven the high tumas erev. A sheretz, the dead gecko, if you touch it, you're only tummy for a day. The high tumas shiva, the dead mace is as when you touch it, you're tummy for 7 days. So therefore, they're totally different items. Kamam the machta tuma bekli damya. So therefore, we would consider as if the dead flesh is as if it's in a keli and sveikai tamei. Oidilma tuma smichtahi. It's all one big tuma. In other words, we would consider as if although the dead flesh, the human flesh is on top of the dead gecko, we would consider as if the dead flesh is on the water itself, and we would not consider the sheretz as a hefsek, as an interruption between the flesh and the water. The intim tzoloima. If you want to say command the machta tuma beklidam, that even when the dead mace is on top of the sheretz, that's considered two different items, and as if the flesh is in a keli, v'tamei vade, v'tamei, and therefore you're considered to be tamei, because suffik tuma b'rshus hayachid sveikei tamei. It's not considered floating in water. What happens if you have a sheretz, a gecko, let's say a dead gecko, al gabe nevela, on top of a dead piece of animal flesh, right? On top of a ribsteak, right? So, and it's floating in water, obviously. Unvela tzofa, and the vela, the ribsteak is floating on the water. Mao, even since, would you consider, and you're not sure, the guy swimmer is not sure if he touched the dead sheretz, but it's not really floating on water. It's floating on top of a piece of meat, of a nevela piece of meat. Even the tarvayu tumas erev inun, since they're both considered dead tumas erev. If you touch the nevela, you're only tummy for a day. If you touch the sherets, you're only tummy for a day. Tumas smichtahi. So we consider it as one tummy, and therefore it's not considered a hefsek. We'll consider the sherets as if it's floating on the water, and therefore sveikoi tar. Idilma hai kazayis v'hai kadasha. In order to be tamei, if order for you to become tamei, touching an nevela, you have to touch a kazayis, an olive's worth of that nevela. In order for you to become tamei, touching a sheretz, you have to touch a lentil bean of that sheretz. So there are two different types of tuma. Therefore, if you have the nevela floating in water, on top of that is the sheretz, maybe we would consider that the sheretz is not considered floating in the water. So if you have a suffix, if you touched it, therefore you'll be tamei. So okay, fine. What would you say about this case? Sheretz al gabe sheretz mahu. If you have one gecko floating on top of another gecko, they're one species, one shear, one tuma. So we don't consider them a hefsek. Idilma, or maybe keeping the mifseke mahadadi, since they're interrupting each other. The top gecko is interfering with the bottom gecko from hitting the water. So therefore, what would you say? Since they're separated, you would say the top is tamei, right? So the top is tamei because sveikai tamei, because it's not floating exactly on the water. So the imtim if you're going to say that sheretz al gabet sheretz, keeping the mifsek de ma'adade, since they're interrupting each other. The top sheretz is command manche beklidame. We consider that as if it's resting in a keli. What about sheretz al gabe nevela shini moichamau? You have a gecko that's floating on a piece of nevela, dead animal carcass, but that animal carcass turned liquefied. Okay, so it's floating on liquid, albeit not water liquid, but nevela liquid. Is that considered floating on water? Even the monamuchahu, since the nevela liquefied, havia kamashka, that's like water, and therefore, if the sheretz is floating on that, we consider it as if the sheretz is floating on water. Again, sheretz floating on water, sveikai tar, idilma hai uchlehu. But at the end of the day, that liquefied nevela is considered like food, and therefore, it's not considered like water. And because of that, the sheretz is not floating on water; it's floating on food, and therefore, sveikai tamei. Even if you want to consider liquefied nevela as food, what about sheretz al gabe shichva zeroma? What would you consider semen? Would you say that if the sheretz is floating on a semen, it's not water, and therefore is that considered as if it's floating on water? Or, says the Gemara, I would think that shichva zera that comes out of a body is really not considered water. We consider that like food because it's departing from a human body, but it's not considered like a liquid. So the imtim shelaima, that if you want to say that shichva zera, even the misakre, since it's dislodged from a human being, we treat it like food. What about sheretz al gabe mechatas? You have sheretz on top of water, but cloudy water, because remember the paraduma water was something that you have water mixed with a lot of ashes. So it's a very cloudy type of water. And the sheretz, let's say, is floating on that water. And this cloudy water is floating on regular water. So would you consider that sheretz to be floating on water, or floating on mechatas? On mechatas not considered as if you're floating on water because the water is cloudy. So, and therefore, if it's not floating on water, sveikai tamei. Mahu, what's the kin in all these cases? Lo yadin, says the Gemara. We don't know. Teku, this remains as a question. Okay, so that ends the first part of today's daf. The next part of today's daf is very short. It's and it goes back to what we discussed before. Let's discuss what we learned yesterday, and that will take us to daf to do in a few minutes. That we learned yesterday. Let's say you're a Nazir and you brought your karbanos, you finished your Naziris, and everything went well. And then a week or two later, somebody tells you, "Oh, I saw that you actually stepped into a cemetery while you were a Nazir." So, and if it's true, then all your Naziris goes to kaput, and you have to restart your Naziris. But what happens if he told you, "Hey, by the way, you went down a certain street. and under the street, we just started excavating, and we found a body that nobody knew what was there. That's called kever hatahoim. Remember that, kever hatahoim. Nobody knew what that was there. Well, we said in the Mishnah that if you completed your Naziris, you don't have to redo the Naziris. And that's a halacha l'Moshe Messinai. Although now you're Tameh, of course, because it turns out that you actually became Tameh because there was a dead body and you passed that street. But when you passed it as a Nazir, nobody knew there was a kever there. And then you finished your Naziris, you brought your Kabbanas. The halacha l'Moshe Messinai says you do not have to recount your Naziris. Now says Rav Hamanuna a certain situation. Omar Rav Hamanuna, Rav Suna says on top of Samach Daled Amud Beis, Nazir v'oisei Pesach. Let's say a guy who completed his Naziris, okay? V'oisei Pesach, or a guy who did Pesach Rishon, right? He's finished, he thinks everything is over, but then somebody told him that, look, this Nazir, during his Naziris became Tameh. Let's say in his Nazir, he became Tameh. Before he completed, he became Tar. A Tameh Mace, for sure. So what does a Nazir do when he becomes Tameh? He gets the sprinkling of the water on the third day of his Tumah. On the seventh day, he gets Paraduma waters. What does he do on the seventh day? He goes to the mikvah. And then when you go to the mikvah, on the eighth day, you bring the Karbonos Tumah, and then you can restart your Naziris. So a guy told him that, look, when you were Tameh as a Nazir, and you were coming out of the mikvah on the seventh day, you crossed, right after you came out of the mikvah, you crossed over a kever hatahoim, a deep kever that nobody knew about. So then, since you were already tahar, you just came out of the mikvah, then the halacha l'Moshe Messinai kicks in, that once you finished your Naziris, you don't have to, if you find that out later on, you don't have to restart your Naziris. However, if they told you while you were Tameh before you went into the mikvah, and then during that time you went over a kever tahaim before you went into the mikvah, so you were a cheskas Tameh. So even if you completed your Naziris and found out that you went over the kever tahaim, but when did you go over the kever tahaim? You went over the kever tahaim, you passed over it when you were a Tameh, and therefore you will remain. The kever tahaim, it will tell you that you have to recount your Naziris. So Amar Rav Hamnuna, let's read what Rav Hamnuna said. Amar Rav Hamnuna says, Nazir v'oisei Pesach, a Nazir and somebody who made his carbon Pesach. He finished his Naziris, and they told him, Sha'alchu b'kever hatoim v'shvi yishlehem. When you were Tameh and you finished your sprinkling of the third and seventh day, and you went into the mikvah on the seventh day, as you left the mikvah, you stepped over a kever hatahoim, tahoirim. Tahoirim means that you don't have to recount your Naziris. You don't have to bring Pesach Sheni because you went over a kever tahoim. The halacha l'Moshe Messinai tells you kever tahoim does not soiser the Naziris. It does not make you demolish what you accomplished, and you don't have to recount. My taima, what's the reason? The loy alima tumas tahoim lemistar. That's a very good way to express it. That tumas tahoim is not such a powerful tuma to cause you to demolish what you accomplished. And therefore, if you found out that you went over this tumas tahoim after you went to the mikvah, after on Shvi, and then you finished your Naziris, you found out that when you left that mikvah, you went over tumas tahoim. It does not demolish your Naziris, you don't have to recount. And also, if you did the carbon Pesach Rishon, you don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara asks one question. Mosiv Rava asked the question, Yored li tar mitumas ameis tamei. Shecheskas tamei tamei, shecheskas tar tar. Our Mishnah seems to disagree. Our Mishnah says that if the guy was coming out of the mikvah, he went into the mikvah to be mitar himself from mitumas ameis, and then left the mikveh and crossed a kever hatahoim, our Mishnah says, Tameh, that you have to, if you find out later, even after you completed your Naziris, you have to recount the Naziris. That's not what Rav Hamnuna said. Rav Hamnuna says, Tahirim, you're Tahir, you don't have to recount your Naziris. Our Mishnah says, you're Tameh, because as long as you still left, you're still at the edge of the mikveh, and you came out of the mikveh, you're still considered to be a cheskas Tameh. Amalei. So Rav Hamnuna answered, Moidina loch benozer shemechusa teglachas. Our Mishnah is talking about you still didn't take the haircut. Remember, Nazir Tameh, in order, after he leaves the mikveh, has to take a haircut. So if you did not take the haircut yet, and then prepare yourself on the 8th day to bring karbonis and start the naziris, the new naziris, you're still considered to be a tameh. And yes, once you have a tumas tahaim, when you are still in the process of being mitar yourself, the halacha l'maishmasina doesn't say that this tumas tahaim is a non-event. It is an event. That's what our mission is talking about. What Rav Hamnuna is talking about, a guy went to the mikvah on the 7th day, and then he got out of the mikvah. After he left the mikvah, he also took the haircut right then and there, right after the mikvah, and then he stepped over at kever tahaim. That kever tahaim is a non-event. That's what Rav Hamnuna is talking about. Amalei Rava said, Afa namadina lach, I would agree to you. You're right. By an oisei pesach, that if somebody who does a pesach never has to take a haircut. If a guy was tameh and came out of the mikvah on the 7th day, and then the next day he brought his pesach rishon, and then they told him, when you left the mikvah, you stepped over kever tahaim, since he was tar already from coming out of the mikvah, so therefore the tumas tahaim is a non-event. It's a non-event because he already brought his pesach rishon, because you never have to take a haircut. Amalei Abaya. Abaya has one problem, and that will end the daf. Amalei Abaya. Abaya has a problem. Even if a guy leaves the mikvah, right? If you leave the mikvah, you still not considered a tahor person, because what you can't eat truma when you leave the mikvah. You need the sun to set, and as long as the sun set, you're considered to be like a tameh. So when you're a tameh, we say tumas tahaim is something to be reckoned with, and because of that. So how could you say that just by leaving the mikvah, you automatically tumas tahaim is a non-event, but as long as the sun did not set, we should consider that a tumas tahaim something serious. Amalei Abaya, at the end of the day, you're missing the sun to set, and therefore you're not a complete tahar person. Amalei, so Rava answered, Shimsha memela arva. The sunset has nothing to do with you; it happens by itself. And because of that, it's not something on you to do. It's just an automatic thing. And therefore, as far as regarding to tumas tahaim, we view you as a tahor diga person because you left the mikvah. So therefore, you're a tahor diga person, and the tumas tahaim is a non-event after your tahor. If you became tameh with the tumas tahaim by nazir and oisei pesach, it's a non-event. And we see Abaya also took this into account, that that if somebody is just missing a sunset, if you're just missing a sunset, Abaya understood and agreed that we don't consider that you're missing anything, because the sun setting is going to happen automatically. And this is how the Gemara is going to end. The Tanya we learned to the Brisa. I'm just going to bring you up, so just one point so that you'll understand what this Brisa is. The Brisa is talking about if a woman, Minat Torah, this is impossible to happen, but Minat Torah, a woman who gives birth, 7 days later, the husband and wife can be together. But she has to wait 80 days after going to the mikvah on the 7th day in order for her to eat karbonis. In order for her to eat karbonis. You know, as Yoledes, a woman giving birth has to bring a carbon on the 81st day. And then following the 81st day, once she brings her carbon, she's now a completely tar digga person, and she can eat karbonis. Now, if let's say on the 95th day, she did not bring her carbon on the 81st day, she's tar, but she didn't bring her carbon. And let's say on the 95th day, she had another baby and a miscarriage. That's possible, because if she's with her husband after day 7, let's say they started to have another child, and that she miscarried on day 95. Now, we can't tell her that with one carbon, you can knock off 2 things. You have to bring 2 carbonis. That's what we tell the lady. Because since it happened after she completed the first 80 days, 81st day, so she's technically obligated, and she potentially could bring carbonis. That's why she would have to bring 2 carbonis, because she had another miscarriage, one for green, one for yellow. That's what I'm showing here on the screen. But what happens, let's say she she had a baby, right? She always starts off with a baby. On day 81, she's supposed to bring the carbon. But let's say she had a miscarriage on day 60. So then on day 81, she could, if she's bringing one carbon, she could bring one carbon for both ladas, the first lada and the lada that she had, the birth that she had on day 60. Not only that, the Bryce is going to tell you that even if she had a baby, another miscarriage on day 130, she could bring one carbon on day 210. Why? Because this second miscarriage is within 80 days of this third miscarriage. I should say the third miscarriage is within 80 days of the second miscarriage. So since they're all connected with each other, you can get away with one carbon. What's the whole point of this? You'll see in the moment, and that's what the Gemara is going to end. The Tanya we learned in the Baraisa. Yoim Melois, on the 81st day, right? The 81st day, if she has a miscarriage from the 81st day and beyond, Havi, this lady has to bring two carbonas, one for the first pregnancy, having a baby girl, and one for the miscarriage. But Toich Melois, but let's say she had a miscarriage within the first 80 days of giving birth, then Loitavi, she doesn't have to bring two carbonas. At the 80, when she could bring, when she waits the extended period of time, she could bring one carbon and kill two births with that one carbon, basically. But let's say she had a third miscarriage, which occurred after the first giving birth, way after day 81 from the first birth. She had a miscarriage, let's say on day 130, but it's within 80 days of the second miscarriage. So she gave birth day 1. Day 60, let's say, she had a miscarriage. Day 130, which is within 80 days of day 60, she had a third miscarriage. So she had 3 ladas. So there, I might think she would have to bring 3 carbonos. Since it's within 80 days, even of the second one, which is within 80 days of the first birth, so then, if it's after the 80 days, Tavi, you have to bring carbonos. Toich Melois, but if it's within 80 days of each other, each one is within 80 days of each other, Loi Tavi, you don't have to bring a new carbon. But here's the point, and here's where it ends. Omar Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana said, Shani Hacha, but something should be different. The Mechasra carbon, Hasaname de Mechasra Shemesh. What's the whole point? Why is it that if somebody had, let's say by the first time, the reason why you can kill, let's say if she had one miscarriage prior to day 81, all you have to do is bring one carbon, is because during the time she had the miscarriage, she anyway could not bring a carbon because she didn't fill the 80 days from the first time she gave birth. So because of that, even if she delayed having her mikvah to day 81, and she decided to go to the mikvah on day 81, why do you tell me if she has a baby after day 81, even if she didn't go to the mikvah till much later, she also was not able to bring a carbon. If she goes to the mikvah, she has to wait till sunset till she's able to bring a carbon. And therefore, why do you say that if she goes on day 81, you bring 2 carbonas? She's not ra'i to bring 1 carbon. So the Gemara ends off, Amalei Abaya, Shimsha Memela Arva. The sun sets automatically. So if the sun sets automatically, that is not considered like you're missing something. Okay, so that's the point, and that's how the Gemara ends this. That Abaya came to the conclusion that you only considered missing something is if you have to do something. But if all you are is waiting for the sunset, that's not called missing anything. Okay, we'll end over here.